Panel vans fade into the background on roads, but you could argue that they're more important to the country's economy than the cars that you and I drive in on a daily basis. And like our cars, there's cutthroat competition between vehicle manufacturers to become the top van. A long time ago, I looked at the history of the Ford Transit, but what about its competitors? What were they doing? What was battling for white van man's hard-earned money in the 1970s? This is the 1970s van story. In 1970, the UK van market was in a transitional phase. The vehicles on sale fell broadly into two camps. On one side, there was designs that were essentially carryovers from the 1950s and early 60s, functional, simple, but increasingly outdated. On the other, you had newer designs that were beginning to look like modern vehicles, with careful attention paid to driving position, usability and flexibility. The Austin Morris J4 is a perfect example of the former. Launched in 1960, it had been churned out of the Cowley factory in large numbers, but by 1970 it was old tech with an awkward driving position and suspension derived from the Austin, Cambridge, Morris, Oxford. The B-series engine, first developed in 1954, was underpowered. Its maximum speed was only 60 miles an hour, and while it got the job done, it didn't do it particularly well. That meant British Leyland couldn't charge very much money for it, which meant less money for a replacement. Many J4s went to the public sector, think Royal Mail vans and the police. In fact, you can see a police J4 on the cover of the Beatles' Abbey Road album. It was there because law enforcement were helping stop traffic for the cover shoot, and quite possibly they also wanted to have their van in the iconic shot. In 1970, BL's focus wasn't on the new J4, it was on their mass market cars. For now, it had the advantage of being a familiar brand, but how long would that last? The Roots Group made the Comma PB, and by 1970 were owned by American Chrysler. The PB, also known as the FC, had launched the same year as the Austin Morris J4 1960 and had a similar design. The petrol or diesel engines were mounted between the seats, and this position meant engine maintenance was a pain in the butt. The only good way of removing the engine was to crane it out through the passenger door. Like the J4, the PB was commonly used by the public sector. There was an attempt to redesign it in 1966 with a cab-forward design, but presumably Roots didn't have the funds and it never happened. So by 1970, the Comma van was beginning to struggle for market share.
I'm the new Ford Transit with a new ultra-short engine, the Ford V4.
The company making all the right moves with their passenger cars was Ford, and it was no different with their van, the Transit. Ford in Detroit was making money hand over fist, and they had the resources to develop cars and vans that could crush the competition. But they got to that position by making cars and vans that people really wanted to drive. And whilst British Leyland and Chrysler wanted to sell the J4 and the Comma across Europe, Ford had a strong dealership network that meant the Transit was a common sight across the whole of Europe. Ford used parts from its cars on the Transit. That stretched the development budget, meaning that they could offer a clean sheet design that prioritised space, usability and driver comfort. A wide track meant the Transit had a larger loading area. The front engine layout made maintenance easier. It was flexible. You could have it short or long, low or high, panel van or minibus. It wasn't just a van, it was a platform. And Ford had smart marketing people who could grab the headlines. They got a Le Mans winning GT40 and put a Transit body on the top, creating the super van that was a staple of racetracks. BL and Comma had nothing to compete with that. The Transit was leaving its rivals in the dust. But Ford wasn't going to have it all their own way. There was a new pretender to the throne. Vauxhall were owned by General Motors and weren't going to let their big rival take all of the market. They'd had 5 years to plan their reply, and the result was the 1969 Bedford CF, which at the turn of 1970 was almost brand new. It was more refined than the previous Bedford van, using the same suspension design as the Victor that gave it a more car-like driving experience. For some buyers, particularly those spending long hours behind the wheel, that mattered. It was modern with the Victor's slant-4 engine forward of the driver. Could it beat the Ford Transit? to become Britain's favourite van of the 70s. Well, not if Ford could help it. The Transit got a small facelift of the front grille on the V4 engine models in 1971, and they also introduced a new safety padded dashboard. These were small changes, but the Transit was still better than its rivals. That and Ford's legendary marketing team meant the Transit continued to take more of the market from British Leyland and Chrysler. The new Bedford took a well-deserved second place. By the time of the fuel crisis in 1973, both BL and Chrysler knew that their vans were far too uncompetitive, and a quadrupling of the fuel price only made matters worse. The cost to run a van is critical to a business, and fuel is the largest expense. Ford and Bedford could call on modern, efficient engines, and if need be, could slot smaller, more efficient models in there. BL and Chrysler needed to react. There wasn't just the fuel crisis, there was also Britain's entry into the European Union. Lowering tariff borders should be great for British business. They could finally sell into the large European market. Well, they could if they had modern products that Europeans wanted. The common market didn't affect Ford much. The Transit was built in the UK, Belgium and the Netherlands. But it was good news for Bedford's modern CF that was produced in Luton, especially when it was going up against a Volkswagen Type 2 that hadn't changed much since the 1950s. It was critical that British Leyland and Chrysler update their vans. Thankfully, BL had squirreled away just enough money to produce a replacement that launched in 1974. It was originally named the Leyland Light Van, but just a year later became the Sherpa. The limited budget meant this wasn't a clean sheet design, but it was still a significant step forward. On paper, the Sherpa ticked all the right boxes. The Austin Morris J4 had the engine between the two seats, making it noisy and cramped. The Sherpa, like the Transit and the Bedford CF, moved the engine forwards, making it quieter in the cabin and easier to maintain. The Sherpa was more modern, more usable, and more in line with what customers expected in the mid-70s. But being based on the existing 1960 J4 platform, the Sherpa was narrower than its rivals, which limited load capacity. It wasn't as flexible in terms of configurations, and it still used the antiquated B-series engine. Then there was a question of build quality and reliability, BL's 1970s Achilles heel. That said, it sold well enough. British Leyland still had a strong relationship with public sector buyers, and the Sherpa found its way into fleets up and down the country. It would become a common sight, but not necessarily because it was the best option available. Europe staged a comeback when Volkswagen debuted the LT in 1975. This was something that could pose a serious threat to the Transit. But in the UK, the Transit wasn't just leading the UK van market, it was dominating. It had already become the default choice for many buyers, particularly in the private sector. The Bedford CF was still in second place, but it wasn't closing the gap to the all-conquering Transit. And with GM's abandonment of car design in Britain, Bedford's van was always going to suffer. At least they became a common sight in Britain as ice cream vans. The common PB had been renamed as the Space Van in 1975, but it had less space than its rivals. It was still on sale, but by now was hopelessly outclassed. Chrysler's UK operation got a government bailout to keep the lights on, and this allowed for a few updates in 1977, including a new interior. It got rebranded as a Dodge, but it wasn't the name or the interior stopping people buying the Space Van. It was the underlying design, and Chrysler UK didn't have the money to change that. It didn't help that even more new competition was on its way. Mercedes-Benz threw their hat into the panel van market with the new T1 van that launched in 1977. Ford quickly reacted. There was a facelift to the Transit in 1977. This wasn't a radical departure from the original concept, more a refinement. The styling became squarer and more modern. The engine bay got larger to offer more configurations, like a V6 if you really needed it. But the most common engine became the well-loved frugal Pinto seen on the Cortina. The dashboard also borrowed components from the Cortina. There were 6 different body styles: van, combi, chassis cab, parcel van, bus and crew bus. Crucially, it maintained everything that made the original successful. The best had just got better. The Leyland Sherpa got a small but important change. The old B Series engine was finally swapped out for the O Series, a brand new unit that was also fitted to the Marina and the Princess. Despite bailouts, Chrysler couldn't make the numbers work and threw in the towel in the UK and Europe in 1978, selling its whole operation to Peugeot Citroën. The Dodge Space Van was an outdated van being produced across the English Channel from Peugeot Citroën's main operation in France, so it's not surprising that its days were numbered. More European competition loomed. Volkswagen's cars had sold very well in the 1970s, and that turned around the company's fortunes. That meant a Type 2 replacement could be fully funded with something bigger, better, and out to get the Transit.
Transit, the supervan. Big, fast, efficient.
The 70s had begun with the Transit being the van to beat. And despite all the changes, turmoil, and new competition, it ended in much the same position. The Ford Transit wasn't just popular, it was ubiquitous. It had become the standard against which everything else was measured. The Bedford CF remained a strong second choice. It was a good van, well liked by those who used it, but it hadn't been able to dethrone the Transit. By the end of the 70s, it was starting to look a bit dated. Changes would, however, come in 1980. The Leyland Sherpa showed the challenges of trying to modernise under constraints. It had took a small share of the market, supported by fleets, but it never quite broke through. Vans from Volkswagen and Mercedes-Benz were the ones to watch. They hinted at a future where engineering, efficiency and durability would play a bigger role. And there were other future competitors like Peugeot, Citroën and Fiat waiting in the wings. The question for the 80s was, could anyone close the gap to the Transit? Could the Bedford 1980s update mount a serious challenge? Could British Leyland get their act together and reclaim their crown? Or would the European competition take over? If I make a video about the 1980s panel van story, then that will be on the right. And if you want to see a video on the whole history of the Ford Transit, that's also on the right. Thanks for watching to the end, and I'll see you in the next video.